In the name of God. Hello everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you will be well. Today we have psycholinguistics. Welcome to newcomers. I hope you have started a new good years. As you know, in a previous sessions we talk about psycholinguistics. Briefly, I will review what we have talked about in previous sessions, and later on we will come to, talk about new topics. In the first chapter, as you know, the book's name, your book name is written by Farala. And this is Psycholinguistics, written by Wind Coles, PhD, and it has been published by Springer. So I again repeat the name of the book, which is Psycholinguistics, written by Wind Coles, PhD, and published by Springer Publishing Company in New York. As you know, this book content is about 8 chapters. In chapter 1, it's the name of the chapter is Introductions. It's talk about, and in this chapter, the writer talk about what is psycholinguistics. In the second chapter, we have language as an object of psycholinguistics or psychological study. In chapter 3, we talk about how we know what we know. And this chapter talk about methods in psycholinguistics. And chapter 4, information flow and language ambiguity will be discussed. Chapter 5, language representations in the brain. And chapter 6, language in the real world, dialects and references. In the last 2 chapters, chapter 7 and 8, we talk about using your hands, and which refers to sign language, and how good is good enough. The final part of the book, as a introduction says, what is psycholinguistics? Language serves a central role in our daily lives and be taking about complex thought and idea, ordering lunch, for example, reading magazine, persuading someone to do a favor. It's hard to imagine going through an entire day without using language. Language is everywhere in human society across cultures. For most people, it's an effortless ability that we acquire before we learn how to, dress ourselves. We acquire language. Some people feel that they even think using language that is an important part of their thought involves a kind of internal monologue. So, as you know, language is not a simple thing. It's actually quite complex, and we need to be able to use it quickly. In fact, its timing is too crucial that even minor delay during the processing of language or thought to have profound consequences. So what is the questions, the main questions, or the topic of this course is, what is psycholinguistics? As the name suggests, it is someone who studied phenomenon in the intersection of linguistics and psychology. It means it's the intersection between these two cores. Linguistics on one side and psychology on the other hand. But it doesn't really answer the questions. It's just pushback. So first, What is linguistics? It's the scientific study of language. What is psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and cognition. So the intersection between the study of language and the study of human behavior is called psycholinguistics. And why the need, for example, for at least for research fields to understand someone as seemingly trivial as language, someone that most people have pretty much mastered before they turn 4. It means before 4 years, a newborn baby completely acquire language ability. That is clear that it's occurred before became in fact full and master before we will become master in language before learning any other kind of ability. And cognitively speaking, it's so hard to imagine this topic. The centrality of language in our daily lives means that any disruptions or ability to use it may be keenly felt. The worse the disruptions, the more devastating the impact. The disruptions can come as a part of aging, it can come from developmental problems, and it can come from damage to brain. In all of the cases, we know that the language, in fact, has got its own position inside our brain. Physical position of language is within our brain, but psychologically speaking, language is not a concrete topic. It's a kind of abstract notion, and we are not dealing with a tangible or concrete topic as a whole. One of the key challenges of processing language, which is the one of the main focus of, in fact, psycholinguistics, is that it comes at people fast. While speaking rates differ somewhat among speakers and language. On average, people have to deal with around 2 to 3 words per second. That's roughly 5 to 6 syllable or 25 to 30 individual sound per second. Perhaps this is not striking to you. Clearly it's easy because everyone can do it. So how is this a challenge? Although it is possible, but how it became a challenge to convince yourself, go right now to in fact a computer and visit a website like, for example, BBC World Service that plays audio broadcasts in language from all over the world. Pick a language that is unfamiliar to you and listen to some of the broadcasts in it. Of course, it's not going to have meaning for you, but let's set that aside from the moment. Focus instead on the sound of the language. Just can you make out the individual sounds? Probably you can catch some of them, but it's impossible. And could you, in fact, write down each sound that you hear? Or can you tell where all the word breaks are? Probably not, since you are not acquainted with that kind of language. So we can conclude that language is easy when you are a native speaker or a fluent speaker of it. But if you do not know that language, any kind of language, I mean, it's hard to even catch all the sounds. And those languages which we are not native speakers of them seems somehow difficult for us, and we think that it's hard, but from the viewpoints of native speakers, it's so simple and they take it for granted. Clearly this is something critical to being a speaker of a language that allows very rapid information processing. This rapid information processing will occur as a result of knowing that language. In the rest of this book, we will examine many of the research findings from psycholinguistics that tell us some things about how these steps works and more. First, however, in this chapter, we will start with a brief history of field to situate the current state of things, and then we will discuss some of the reaching issues that frame much of the research. And finally, we will cover a brief overview of the rest of the chapter in this book. Okay, in the next part, we want to, talk about from the beginning of the psychology, there has been an interest in language. Wilhelm, for example, published a book on language in 1900, and that book, which has got about 1,067 pages, covered a number of topics that are still very much relevant in current psycholinguistics, including, for example, child language acquisition, sign language, language perceptions, and grammatical structure. The interest between the domain of language and psychology was mutual, and some scientists discussed that many linguists of the day were also interested in, for example, Wundt's works, and attended his lecture at a university of Leipzig, including several influential language research such as Leonard Bloomfield, Ferdinand de Saussure, and Edward Boas. For instance, Bloomfield's approach to analyzing the structure of language is important to almost all modern theories of grammar. De Saussure made a critical distinction that is still part of how language researchers think about language. Language, which is knowledge of language systems that exist collectively among speakers of language, and parallel on the other side, has been introduced by Ferdinand de Saussure, which is the use of that system for an excellent history of linguistics. While Wundt was experimentalist, in fact, famously so, he's considered by many of the father of modern experimental psychology. He also acknowledged the importance of internal mental states and view language as importantly to internal mental states, and importantly reflecting mental representations. He viewed the sentence as a key unit of language and thought to show how universal characteristics of human information processing, in fact, like attention and memory, would influence its productions and comprehension. As you know, productions and comprehensions are two key elements of psychological studies. Wundt was not the only researchers at that time interested in language, of course, and in fact there was some conflict between Wundt's approach and others, including approaches that disagree with the idea of unified mental representation And the other type of introspective approach, in fact, at turn of the century, there were quite a number of competing perspectives on psychology, which led one linguist of the day, Bernard Delborg, to suggest that linguistics might do better to part away with psychology. This is largely what happened, and for the next 30 to 40 years, linguistics focused instead on formal aspect of language, for example, sound system, grammatical structures, word formation rules, without much reference to mental processing needed for their actual use. They in fact keep themselves away from mental processing. This approach still forms a core aspects of linguistic study today. Although one's works clearly foreshadow a modern view in topic science psycholinguistics, his influence declined, in fact, following the First World War. Bloomfield one's approach had turned to be behaviorism instead by 1933, when he published one of his major contributions to linguistics, a book simply called Language. You may heard the name of Bloomfield's book, Language. In psychology, behaviorism was movement in which the study of mental states was more or less rejected, and the idea that one could account for human behavior in terms of mental state and representations was discounted. In linguistic terms, this means a stronger focus on descriptive account of language rather than studying language as in fact window onto human minds. You know that you may hear the Skinner's name, who was Skinner's 1957's verbal behavior, in which language is not a complex. He considered language not as a complex mental construct with rules and representations, but instead is reduced to verbal behavior, and who was one of the important scientists or behaviorist scientists, Skinner's verbal behavior. In this book, he considered language as a behavior, as a kind of behavior like any other behavior of human being, and he doesn't consider language as a very complex mental problem or topic, but consider it as a crucial very tangible topic. As such, it can be explained according to Skinner in terms of the same conditioning theory, and that applies to other behaviors such as, for example, classical and operant conditioning. He believed that language is learned by experience, and there is a link between stimuli and outcomes, and they in fact shape experience. For instance, let me give you an example. If a child saying "I want milk," it may result in a child receiving a glass of milk, and this reinforces or conditions the use of this verbal behavior. So it means the child, based on Skinner's view, child will receive a reward for in fact pronouncing this word. If he or she says "I want milk," he will receive a glass of milk. So it's a kind of stimuli and response, and it's considered as a reinforcement for repetition of this behavior. You know that the trouble was that there are a number of aspects of language that cannot be explained just by classical or operant conditioning. In famous critic of Skinner's books, Noam Chomsky in 1957 successfully argued against verbal behaviorism with several key points. Crucially, as we will see in the next chapter, language is recursive and can produce an infinite number of sentences from a finite set of systematic rules and representations. The complexities of language that these rules create are difficult, if not impossible, to account for in simple stimulus-response terms. As a part of his argument, Chomsky introduced the idea of mental representation back to study of language. So you know that one of the most critics of Skinner's behaviorism is Noam Chomsky in 1957, who was against behaviorism and who was in favor of, in fact, mentalist approach, and he considered language as a, in fact, mental behavior, not a behavior which can be learned by stimulus, response, and experience. You know that there was a, briefly speaking, as a result, we can say there was relatively little interaction between the study of psychology and linguistics for the next couple of decades, and psychologists were studying were still interested in language very much, but focused more on issues of performance, such as the processes by which syntactic structure are constructed in real time, how ambiguities in language are resolved, and how word knowledge is accessed upon encountering a word. Linguists were still interested in language as a mental phenomenon, but focused on issue of competence, what knowledge of language entails, as formulating theories that could apply to all language regardless of the apparent differences among them. So we can see that in one hand, psychologists were interested in studying language, and linguists were interested in studying psychological aspect of language. And the separation between these two fields was not to last, and starting in the late of 1980 and early 1990, there was a renewed interest in psycholinguistics as a joint venture between linguistics and psychologists. And we have so many researchers working at intersections of language and other cognitive abilities, including not just working memory, but things like, for example, perceptions and the process of reasoning. It's actually a very exciting time to be a psycholinguist, both because of this explosion of a new interdisciplinary endeavor and because prior work has meant that we have started to build a solid foundations of understanding about how language processing works. We talked about top-down versus bottom-up processing in a previous session. Please listen to that voice, and if you have any ambiguity or problem, you can contact me. Serial versus parallel processing has been discussed too, and automatic versus controlling process. process. After that, we talk about modularity. You know that modularity is the final key themes, is the issue of modularity. This actually, in fact, comes into two flavors. First, there is the degree to which individual processes within language processing are distinct and isolated from each other. And second, there is a degree to which language as a system is distinct and isolated from other cognitive systems. With respect to modularity generally, further proposed several key properties of modular process. Modular processors are specific to particular domain, automatic, fast, and not affected by feedback from other processes. These topics related to modularity and how language is composed of different modules and how language is separated and is divided from other cognitive abilities too. In the next chapter, we in fact talk about language as an object of psychological studies. As you know, in this book we are going to talk a lot about language, and so it makes sense to start with overview of some language basic, particularly those that are relevant for the rest of the book. Language is complex but rule-governed system. First of all, language in itself is a system. It means it's composed of different little parts or small parts which work together. But language is a complex but rule-governed system. A system which is both complex on one side and rule-governed on the other hand. Nowadays we have about 6,900 spoken version of language by definition, and there is some differences and similarities between languages. The sheer number of differences and complexity of language combined with a relative recentness of modern linguistic study, we have meant that we still do not have a complete account of how every individual language works, nor a complex unifying theory of how language as a whole works. And these are problems, but we have some pretty good ideas. So we start with the sound system of a language. One of the hallmark of a language is the way in which units of meaning, for example, words, are composed of small, non-meaningful segments. These segments can be combined and also recombined in a potentially infinite number of ways, allowing for potentially infinite number of words. So we have a limited element, but they can combine in various ways repeatedly and created new words. In spoken language, segments are sounds. Each language has a set of sounds that are produced by changing the position of a previous part of the vocal tract, various part of the vocal tract. There are two important aspects of these segments. First, they have no independent meaning. So there is nothing about b sound. For example, in a word like bird, there is not any specific meaning related to b. And the sound, and this sound is a arbitrary symbols. Other languages use different sounds to refer to the same things. For example, in English we call it bird, but in Persian we say parande. So it means that a different language can use this sound arbitrarily, and not all the languages use the same combination of sounds to refer or in fact shows the same entity in outside words. The reason that this is important is that it makes language very flexible. The sound system of language is actually studied in two main parts, phonetics and phonology. Phonetic is the study of actual sound in language and how they are produced. It's somehow a concrete topic, whereas phonology is not dealing with, in fact, system of, in fact, study of actual sounds in language, but phonology is concerned with how sounds are mentally categorized and the rules that govern how they are combined. So in phonology we are dealing with how sounds of language are mentally categorized, but in phonetics we are dealing with the study of actual sounds, how they are produced. And the first one is a concrete topic, but the second one is abstract. As we have studied in phonetic, you will study the speech sounds. You will discuss about the manner of articulation, place of articulations, and voicing for each sound. And we categorize the sounds into two main groups. The first one is consonant and the second one is vowels. Vowels are somewhat different from consonant. First of all, while consonants may be voiced or voiceless, vowels or all of the vowels are voiced. And also the airflow through the vocal tract is not constricted the way that it can be for consonants. Different vowels are produced by changing the position of tongue in a mouth and rounding of the lips. Vowels tend to be louder and longer than consonant. They can be a pick of a syllable, but it's not possible for most of the consonant. In addition to transcribing sounds using a special alphabet, as you know, IPA as a specific phonetic alphabet, the other way that one could write down or visualize the sound that we produce for a language is to show what the sound waves of the sound look like. For example, this branch of study is called, for example, acoustic linguistics. Acoustic linguistics study the spectrograms and show the different qualities, for example, or the different frequencies in human voice as speech unfolds. On the other side, we have phonology describing the way language sounds work in section above and makes the whole system sound fairly straightforward, but there are in fact a number of complicating issues with understanding speech sounds. Crucially, we need to get from sound waves to language sounds. Phonetic is principally concerned with physical sound of language, whereas phonology is concerned with the rules that different languages apply to these sounds, including how the physical sounds map into linguistic categories, categories of sounds for a given language. Language often group together similar sounds into a single sound category called, for example, phoneme. To better understand, let's start with some example. Little and kitten, top and stop. Most speakers of English, when asked if there is a common sound that is shared by all these words, will say yes, it's t sound. However, in fact, the sound that English speaker hear as t in these examples is actually different in each of words, regardless of the speakers. In little, the t sound is formed by briefly tapping the tip of tongue against alveolar ridge. But in kitten, the t is formed by briefly constricting airflow in the voice box or anything else. But as mentioned earlier, another important aspect of sound in language is that language will typically have rules about where phonemes can occur and what other phonemes they can or cannot occur with. This refers to phonotactic rules, which let the sounds come together, and it's about the rules which let the sounds to come together. With respect to psycholinguistics, a big issue related to sound system of language, or how sounds are actually produced and how we are able to correctly identify speech sounds in real time. This is in fact, intersections between psychology and phonology or phonetic. Next topic is about words and word structures, which is the study, the domain of, in fact, morphology, studying the word and word structure. It's enough for this session. The next sessions I will come to this topic, word and word structure. It was just a review of a previous topic and discussing the main issue in psycholinguistics. Thank you very much for your attention and have a nice time.